What's up, guys? So I am Dave Maconi, the host of the Brains and Gains podcast. I recently got to have Alex Bromley on my channel to discuss a lot about strongman, performance-enhancing drug use in strongman, the mentality of elite strongman, and how that differs from maybe general population or people with different goals, and a lot of other great topics. So we have part two on Alex's channel here, part one on my channel, Brains and Gains podcast. Hope you guys really enjoy the talk.
Now, you mentioned earlier, a little bit of a disparity between what barbell medicine was saying about the back issue stuff and somebody like Stu McGill. And to draw kind of a parallel there, I think the undertones of that discussion is really what's the messaging and how's it going to affect whether or not people stay or go? Like if you have a back injury and you tell somebody that, oh, there's something wrong with you mechanically, I think a big point is that, oh, well, these new lifters who are like scared deer, and if you give them the wrong message, they'll get wide-eyed and run away, and we can't have that. We need people in here at all costs. Whereas I tend to be not so interested in preserving engagement at all costs, especially if it means limiting action, I guess. That would be kind of the smartest, most straightforward thing that you can do right now. So I tend to be kind of uncharitable. Same thing with expectations. You talk about Mike O'Hearn, you talk about people talking about steroid use and what their expectations are. And there's this big talk that like people not being upfront about gear use leads to unrealistic expectations. And it just goes back to, it's like, how much work do the people at the top have to do to make sure that the consumers at the bottom are kind of taken care of? And there's a point where I just don't care. And also because I know that I'm one person in a big C, I don't think the problem with the field at large is that the people coming in aren't treated well enough. If anything, right. I feel like I'm kind of pulling that pendulum back a little way by being a grouchy coach of that.
I think there is over time, I understand why so many people kind of get a little bit salty. Like, I don't know if you know Lyle McDonald, but he's obviously an extreme example of that. And Lane Norton is another one where you start to get, I guess, like just unenthused with all this stuff. And you mentioned before, like you had you wanted to kind of work on yourself to not have these kind of maybe outbursts in the comment section. If anything, though, I found that, and maybe this is just me getting more comfortable with the podcast, but there are definitely times now where I still try to be professional, but there's times where I just have to roll my eyes and just be like, man, like this is so ridiculous. I'm either not going to answer, or if you really want me to answer, I'm just going to troll you back because it's just so silly at this point. But when you hear it for over a decade, it gets a little bit, old.
Yeah, eventually it can roll off your back. And that's kind of the rule too, I take. It's like, as soon as somebody, I think, crosses that line where you can tell that they're being just kind of shitty and trolly, it's like, you're not here to have a serious conversation. Yeah. And it's weird because even when you do give the time to the people, it's like, is this person really interested in what I'm saying? Am I doing this for myself, my ego, so I can get the last word?
Right.
With me, more often than not, that's exactly what happens. So I don't know where to go with that.
Just curious with the Stu and the barbell medicine thing, not asking you to pick a specific side, but I don't know if you've ever had any chronic back issues. Obviously it's pretty common with, some lifters, but do you have a general principle where you kind of follow more of the, hey, just kind of slowly introduce things that don't hurt method? Or do you think, hey, we need to diagnose a specific problem and attack that, if you've ever had any personal experience there?
Yeah. And I did that. My whole role in that one's kind of near and dear to my heart because that wasn't just me filling content or just passing off information. I had 10 straight years of chronic low back injuries.
Wow.
That just absolutely sidelined all my progress. And I was able to find workarounds where I could still squat. This is before my hips gave me shit and I couldn't squat anymore. So it's always something. But I could do workarounds I could always do upper body, and I could do workarounds with strongman events, and I'd be okay on some of them. A lot of my preps, though, like a few dozen of them, I'm stringing myself along by the skin of my teeth. Trying not to do any more harm because I knew what that was like from when I was overeager and I thought I'd bounce back super quick. Because you do when you're 16, and then when you're like 25, and when you're 30, like not quite so much. So I've done damage by kind of shutting my brain off and saying like, oh, well, I'll be fine. The body adapts, So right. I do have a bias there because the body adapts right up until the point where it doesn't. And if there is something, for whatever percent of the time, it is something mechanistic, if you ignore it and it's predicated, its existence is based off things you were doing before, well, then the inevitable conclusion is it gets worse. So I'm not saying it doesn't every time if you're going to lump all back issues together. So I do, and I haven't talked to the guys directly, and I have to be fair because it does get to be a very precise, very complex topic. I've investigated the way people discuss it online and in forums, and it's kind of hard to parse out exactly what they believe in which situation. So I don't want to speak for them, but I do tend to be a little more biased towards something like McGill because that is actually what helped me get over it. And that's also paired with what I see going on in lifters. I know a lot of people who've had chronic back issues, not like I tweaked my back once and I forgot about it. Now I'm fine and it's no big thing. I know a lot of people who have, in the vein of continuously trying to get better and put their head down and just go through that brick wall, had an issue. They ignored it because they had a competition coming up, took painkillers, took anti-inflammatories. 4 years later, it's still a thing. And when I say a few, I don't mean like 2 or 3, I mean like 15 or 20. So when I see what lifters are actually doing, and I have kind of a strict definition of what a lifter is, because that's another thing you can get into with like collecting data and stuff like that. But the people that have been around for years, the people that have that competitive mindset and are constantly trying to load and grow into that next big class, there are not a lot of people that are prioritizing work on their midsection, that are prioritizing work on actually figuring out the mechanics of how they build tension to sustain their spine under these crazy loads. And when I see that as a weakness, I know that's what I struggled with. I know other people struggle with that. It kind of makes sense that like, well, if you focus on that worst case scenario, you have a stronger midsection than when you started, which is a net positive. You're going to move more efficiently, right? That's a worst case scenario. So I have a hard time looking at that and really giving a lot of attention on like, well, you know, you're spreading fear mongering or whatever by addressing it. It's like, we don't treat any other weakness that you would potentially have in a lift that way. We don't put those stakes up like, oh, you know, your triceps should come up, they're a little bit small. It's like, well, if you tell them that, they're going to stop benching. It's like, not really. So that's where I lean. I fully appreciate and understand that there are a lot of times where people get little tweaks, they think it's the end of the world, and they stop lifting when they would just be better off getting back to it. So it's a balancing act. And we probably need a lot more information, a lot more careful discussion about which groups we're talking about to really say anything meaningful about it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good perspective. I just picked up Back Mechanic recently by Stu. I'm only like 1 chapter in, so I haven't really gotten into the depth of it. But I think there's also a point where you get to such a long period of time with chronic back pain. I mean, I'm not 10 years into it, but it's been a while. And obviously with my career, it affects that too. So it's like a day-to-day thing. And so you kind of just want an answer. And even if you have to combine approaches, it's like, well, you can kind of do both of these. You can still address it like the way Stu talks about, while still potentially slowly introducing other things. But like you said, I mean, worst case scenario, I don't think you're going to necessarily do harm by addressing those weaknesses.
Yeah. So like, well, what is your experience? Like, what have you gone through? Were you lifting when you tweaked it, or it's just been building?
So honestly, I don't really have like a clear diagnosis. When I was in 6th grade, I bent over to pick up a basketball, and I guess, quote unquote, threw my back out. I like couldn't get up. I was like, what is going on? Went to the nurse, whatever, went home. Went to a chiropractor, and you know, obviously there's a lot of questionable practices with some chiropractors, right? Some say the entire field is pseudoscience. Other people love the chiropractor. I've had good and bad chiropractors. The good ones, though, even then, I feel like they kind of veered off away from some of the hokey stuff and maybe got into a little bit more evidence-based. But in any case, after that, I had some deadlift injuries where I was just being dumb and like pulled when I shouldn't have pulled. And that was like the kind of more classic, my low back hurts. You know, I can barely put my socks on, but it goes away within a few days and I'm fine. And then, you know, early 20s, everything kind of recovers. Now it's more this general low to mid back pain where I actually just recently found I had to take out seated leg curl and leg extension because something about the legs, like the knees being extended and hip being flexed, something about that position was just sending my entire mid to low back off. Don't know what that was about. Thankfully, I was able to do lying leg curls. I was able to do squatting, no problem. So it was very specific to that position. And then, you know, I have like a very expensive ergonomic chair I work in. It's because it's not like I'm just a lifter, you know, I'm also doing these like little micro surgeries I do throughout the day. And it's hard to know, is it from that? Is it my posture from 8 hours a day? Or is it this one acute thing? Or is it a mattress? Like so it's a little bit harder than just like this one lift caused a problem, you know?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of things you have to parse out, and you physically can't, right? So you're left with your best guess. Um, that's really hard. So you had this initial injury when you were very young, and then it's not like something popped in the last few months and now it hurts. It's just the pain sort of.
No, I don't think there was any. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think there was any acute injury that caused this. I was really feeling like it was just chronic. I thought it was again more from work, but I will say it was definitely exacerbated by my leg days and that specific position I mentioned with knees extended and hips flexed. I thankfully it is a little bit better now, but still I'll like get up. This is why I thought maybe it was the mattress too, because I'd get up in the middle of the night to go like pee or something, and I'm just like, oh my god, I'm having to like roll to the side. So yeah, it's definitely frustrating, and it was getting to the point where I was like, oh, I gotta up my disability insurance here because this is this is starting to become a problem.
So when you talk to like, or if you read through McGill stuff, I interviewed, like you said, you pointed out, I interviewed Brian Carroll a couple of years ago, and they'll talk about things like tolerance, flexion, and extension tolerance. And anybody who does that, I was doing leg curls the other day, and it was a thought popped in my head because that was something I would avoid because any tension on my low back was out of the question for so long. But there's that point where you start to fatigue, and you're really trying to get that squeeze, and you feel that little bit of like pelvic tilt, right? It's like you're trying to compensate. And if you have a sensitive area there, I can absolutely see how that would light it up. So then it's like, okay, well, is that the thing? Is it just the movement of the hips is causing some things to move into a painful area? And when I like attack this stuff with myself, or God help me if I'm trying to give anybody else advice, I have to start like, hey, I'm not a doctor, but you might try X, Y, or Z. Worst case scenario won't make you worse. But I always have this like umbrella rule because you can only do that. It's the reason that people go to chiropractors. They're not doing this in the rest of the medical field. So where do you go to get this taken care of? You know, if a masseuse feel better, that's where you're going to go. Yeah, because we all know what it's like going to a general physician and they come in, they just shrug their shoulders like, here's some ibuprofen, stop deadlifting. And that's the best that they can do. And it's
going to a primary care physician for any orthopedic issue, it's basically a waste of time. I mean, I have plenty of MD friends and they wouldn't even know unless they have actually I have MD friends who have a lifting background who still wouldn't know where to start. I mean, it's just, and it's tough also because there's not always, I mean, I'm sure you've seen there's MRI studies where people have clear, you know, quote unquote issues on the MRI, no pain. Other people who have severe chronic pain, nothing shows up on the MRI. So there's not this like, well, here we found the problem and this is why you have that specific pain.
Yeah, and that's why the best approach that makes sense to me anyways is given a lack of information from like that 30,000 foot evidence-based point of view, the best thing you can do is trial and error. It's not that different than figuring out what works for lifting by itself, because we have this data kind of, and we have a sense that some of it works really well for some people and some maybe this way for others, and maybe there's some people who aren't going to do great no matter what. Like we have this idea of all the variance that goes on in it, but at the end of the day, no matter what, you're on the hook for figuring out what the right answer is, and the right answer is going to be something that's sustainable and allows you to grow. So when you're treating issues, it's like, you know, what do I know, what do I have control over, what can I change? You just start going down the line. For me, like you were saying, it's your mattress. When my back hurt, I would sleep on the floor. I slept on the floor for probably 4 months.
Wow.
And you know, my wife had a comforter down there and a pillow for me, and it was incredible. Like I would wake up the next morning, instant difference between a morning where I slept on my mattress. Now my back's reasonably healthy. I don't feel like I have to do that.
So you still had a comforter on the floor though?
Just a comforter, yeah, not a real heavy one. I mean, it was still.
And you were on your back, or do you sleep on your side at all?
I sleep all over. Yeah, I'd have a couple of pillows to like wedge between my knees. Usually I sleep on my stomach, actually.
Really? I sleep on my side mostly. Sometimes my back, cannot sleep on my stomach though.
Interesting. Yeah. So I will pack a pillow under my hips because sleeping on my stomach sometimes causes my back to get a little achy. But yeah, there was this article I read a long time ago, and it was all like conjecture, but some anthropologist was studying the sleeping habits of like native populations, and all over the world there were these instances of the way people slept on the floor where they just put some hay down or something, and he was comparing it to like chimpanzees and how they sleep. And it was this idea that as your rib cage expands as you breathe, you have this really firm thing pushing against you, and there was some like alignment voodoo that went on and like reset or whatever. Maybe. Huh. All I know is that there was a tangible result at a point where I was trying everything and nothing was working. So that was one thing. But yeah, you don't know what it is. You cast a wide net, you see what works, you make changes as you go.
Did you do any sort of consulting with Brian or Stu directly, or just kind of like through the books?
How did I stumble across that? I didn't talk to them until well after. Yeah, this is a problem because I feel like I know a lot and I can only point to like where I learned like 5% of it.
Yeah, sure.
It's all a mishmash of blogs and books and talking to people. I can't remember where I got put on to McGill's stuff. Actually, I want to say, now that I think about it, there's a buddy of mine, Chris Burke, who's a really good middleweight strongman. He's partners with Leifa Engels, who was the first woman to ever win the women's Arnold the first year they had it. And Chris got nasty strong for a minute, but he was another guy with chronic issues, and he was working with a specialist, like you said, and I remember the exercise he was doing. This is before I ever implemented it for myself, but a lot of it was derived from McGill. He was doing the McGill 3. He was doing things like stir the pot, where you're like doing a plank on a Swiss ball, you're doing circles. Well, because the whole idea is to brace and not let your spine move. So then you get better at moving your limbs and not letting your spine move. Then before long, you're like, oh, this is what a hip hinge is. I was doing something else. I was like rounding over and unfolding like a snake. And I remember he had to pull out of a contest because he couldn't deadlift 400 pounds. And then next thing you know, he's deadlifting over 800 pounds beltless. And he documented his whole thing, and he got anyway. So I saw that and I started doing that. And I realized, oh, I hated deadlifts for so many years. Part of the reason I didn't know how to brace, I didn't know how to get tight. I was hanging on my erectors. My build played into that. I'm the opposite of somebody who should be pulling recklessly. So it all just came together. And for anybody, like I can look at my journey and be like, oh, I figured it out. I know why. And gee, aren't I so smart? But for anybody going through that, I have a lot of sympathy for how hard it is to kind of get all those ducks in a row and figure out what's really going on.
Yeah, no, for sure. So maybe a good topic to wrap up on, because we were talking before about how obviously with strongman, especially at any high level, it really is something that you're going to see most people are enhanced. Obviously, most people should be lifting though, right? And I think my general stance is I don't really care if somebody's enhanced, but I don't think most people should be enhanced unless you really have a good reason for it. So what would you then tell somebody who likes the idea of strongman, wants to get into strongman, but is not looking to be on enhancements for maybe a decade or whatever it would take? Do you still encourage them just do it for fun? Can they get into a community that isn't just kind of pushing it on them, things like that?
100%. In fact, most of the communities aren't, and it's something I could be critical of. It depends what hat I'm wearing. If I'm the hardcore competitor that just wants to turn out champions, I'll be critical of it for being too soft. But on the other hand, it's like you can be critical of it the other way. It's very inclusive in a lot of ways, in a way that brings people in a way that's very easy to get into. It's never been more accessible than it is now. There's so many shows everywhere. There's strongman equipment everywhere, strongman gyms everywhere. And one of the reasons it's grown is because people love the community. People glorify these strength sports a little bit, like acting like everybody is a saint and it's like the greatest thing ever and everybody's just so nice everywhere you go. It's a sport that's filled with humans. There's a lot of dick bags out there, but I would say that your positive experiences largely outweigh the negative. And when people find their communities, they find that it's extremely positive, and you're going to find it at about any gym you go to. So it's not like it's necessarily rolling the dice, but that's it. It's like, if you're interested in doing it, know why you're doing it. The reasonable response is that I need a hobby. That I like the idea of being stronger, more useful. I like the idea of doing something hard and chipping away at it. And I want to associate with other people that are going to help me get as far as I can possibly go. If those are your primary reasons for doing anything, then the rest should be easy, should be just following through. As far as the enhancement thing goes, almost nobody, trying to think if I've come across anybody in strongman. Powerlifting might be a bit different, but it's rare to find places where it's so open or it's so advocated for that it gets pushed on people early. The wisdom that exists just about everywhere, that anybody who's been doing this more than a day will tell you, young kids, I would say anybody under 20 has just about no reason to do it. And if you're young and you do it, it's stupid. You're risking potential damage. You're setting yourself back. You're going to screw up your ability to actually understand how programming works because you gave yourself this, super anabolic sauce, which is going to mess with your head. God help you ever go off it, you're not going to know what to do. So it's going to set you back long term. And that, like you said, I agree with that 100%. You shouldn't do it unless you have a really good reason to do it. Thinking your first day that you're going to be, this far in 10 years, that's a really bad reason. At the very least, get in, pay your dues, see what it's about, learn some things, figure out the tolerance of your body, figure out the technical aspect, get all these things in a row. Do a couple novice shows. They don't even have just open shows anymore. When I started, it was open. Now they have novice shows where the weights are scaled way back. There's nothing on the line. So there's so many opportunities to get in and learn and sharpen your craft. And either way, there's so many events. It's not something you're going to pick up in the first year. It's like, unless you're committed to spending 4 or 5 years, steady, consistent practice, you're not going to end up at the national championships as a contender for the podium. So understand what you're willing to put into it, know what you want to get out of it, and that's really just about it.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I think it's great advice. I think it's hard when you're getting started to know, because I think there's this general lifting community, but then of course you have these kind of niches, right? CrossFit versus strongman versus powerlifting, bodybuilding. But I think most people should just get in there and start lifting. And then almost in the same way of like trial and error we talked about before, you'll kind of find what you gravitate towards, what you're better at, right? And kind of what suits your personality. Because I do think there's certainly significantly different training styles, right? Maybe certain avenues you go down might require much more frequency versus, maybe more volume or intensity or whatever works for you. So I think when you're that early on, a couple of years in, it makes sense to just try a ton of different things.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just so much trial and error that goes into it.
Cool, man. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. Where can people find more stuff?
So most of everything I do is on YouTube, just my name, Alexander Bromley. I have kind of a ghost town of an Instagram account, Brahmarama, if anybody wants to see what's on there. And that's about it. Easiest way to get a hold of me is to email me, bromley@empire-barbell.com, or, DM me on Instagram and see how that goes. That's about it. Thanks for having me on, man. This was a blast.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Got it.